Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the United Kingdom. Now, if you follow the channel, you'll know that the UK is under immense pressure right now. It is skirting just above being officially in recession. And one of the problems that the UK is suffering from is that it has a shortage of workers in certain sectors. And the way that the UK government has tried to address this is by bringing in what they've called a shortage occupation list. So the UK government has listed a variety of different occupations, and if you're an employer in one of those sectors, you're legally allowed to recruit people from overseas and pay them less than you would pay to UK workers. So basically the UK is trying to benefit from the differential between the relatively high wages in the UK and lower wages in other economies by allowing companies to be able to bring people over and pay them around 80% of what they would have to pay to UK workers. And this scheme has proved to be highly controversial, and there have been a number of calls to scrap it. And of course, one of the reasons that the UK is suffering from a worker shortage is Brexit. Back in 2016, the UK held a referendum amongst all of the population and asked everybody to vote on whether they wanted to remain or leave the European Union. And the outcome of that vote was to leave the European Union. And the major implications of that were twofold. Firstly, the United Kingdom left the free trade agreement that was in place between all of the member states of the European Union. So that means that any imports that now come from European Union countries potentially now have tax applied to them, so that they're more expensive for UK consumers. And that's one of the reasons why inflation has been so much higher in the UK than it is in the rest of Europe. But the other major implication was that the freedom of movement of people was also removed. So all of the skilled workers that were previously coming from countries such as Poland, where they were able to travel directly to the UK and not need to worry about a visa, those workers are now required to have a visa before they can enter the UK and work legally. And the introduction of those rules has now led to a net emigration from the UK of European Union citizens. And of course, one of the main arguments at the time of Brexit was that immigration was too high. Too many people were coming to the UK, and there were concerns that it was going to put too much pressure on things like the National Health Service. So that was a driver for a lot of people voting to leave the EU. However, surprisingly, since Brexit has been put into place, net migration to the UK has actually increased. And in the 12 months ending June 2023, over 672,000 people moved to the UK. And if we compare that to June 2016, which was the time of the Brexit vote, the figure was 335,000. So net migration to the UK has more than doubled since Brexit was put into place. But of course, the breakdown of where those people are coming from is very different to what it was in 2016. Back in those days, the majority of people moving to the UK were coming from the European Union. Today, we've got a far higher percentage from countries such as India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and China. So from a big picture point of view, it looks like Brexit hasn't actually achieved one of the desired outcomes. And Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister of the UK, who's likely to be facing a general election in early 2024, so he's under pressure himself, has now brought in new legislation to try to tackle the problem of immigration. So in today's video, we'll have a detailed look at the new legislation that's been passed by the UK government. We'll look at the migration figures and see what's been happening over the last few years. We'll have a look at the reasons why people are moving to the UK, which countries they're coming from, and how the UK compares to the rest of the world in terms of the percentage of population that were born in other countries. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the impact of this new legislation will be on the UK economy and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everybody that supported the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a Patreon or a YouTube member, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. The United Kingdom has announced plans to slash the number of migrants arriving by legal routes, raising the minimum salary they must earn in a skilled job by a third, amid pressure on Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to tackle record net migration figures. High levels of migration have dominated Britain's political landscape for more than a decade and were a key factor in the 2016 vote to leave the European Union. Rishi Sunak has promised to gain more control after his Conservative Party criticised his record ahead of an election expected in early 2024. Figures released in November show annual net migration to the United Kingdom hit a record 745,000 in 2022 and has stayed at high levels since then, with many migrants now coming from places like India, Nigeria and China instead of the EU. Home Secretary James Cleverly said the new measures could reduce that number by 300,000. Immigration is too high. Today we're taking radical action to bring it down, said Sunak, who's also trying to deport migrants who arrive illegally to Rwanda. Cleverly said the government would raise the minimum salary threshold for foreign skilled workers to £38,700, around $49,000, from its current level of $26,200, although health and social workers will be exempt. Other measures include stopping foreign health workers bringing in family members on their visas, increasing a surcharge migrants have to pay to use the health service by 66%, and raising the minimum income for family visas. The measures could spark new disputes with business owners who've struggled to hire workers in recent years, given Britain's persistent tight labour market and the end of free movement from the EU since Britain's 2020 exit from the bloc. In October, the government's independent migrants advisor recommended abolishing the so-called shortage occupations list, one of the main routes for businesses to hire migrant workers in sectors where there are severe staff shortages. Cleverly said the government would end the current system that lets employers pay migrants only 80% of the going rate to do jobs where there is a worker shortage, and that the list of shortage occupations would be reviewed. We need to stop immigration undercutting the salary of British workers. We will create a new immigration salary list with a reduced number of occupations, Cleverly said. However, some studies have shown foreign workers have little or no impact on overall wage or employment levels, and Britain's acute shortage of candidates to fill vacancies remains a problem for many company bosses. Officials estimate around 100,000 fewer visas for social carers and dependents, and 140,000 fewer from a previously announced change to rules on students bringing in dependents that will take effect in January. The new measures announced by Cleverly will take effect in spring 2024. And officials are concerned that the changes may induce a last-minute dash to enter the UK. Kate Nichols, Chief Executive of trade body UK Hospitality, said these changes will further shrink the talent pool that the entire economy will be recruiting from and only worsen the shortages hospitality businesses are facing. We urgently need to see an immigration system that is fit for purpose and reflects both the needs of business and the labour market. The system at the moment does none of that. The Bank of England said last month that businesses were finding it a bit easier to hire, but persistent skills shortages remained in some sectors. Trade unions also voiced concerns at the new plan, with Christina McAnear, the General Secretary of Unison, the main union in the health sector, saying it spelled total disaster for the health service. Migrants will now head to more welcoming countries rather than be forced to live without their families, she said. This chart shows the movements in the UK's net migration dating back to 2018. The scale on the right-hand side of this chart represents hundreds of thousands of people and goes from minus 200,000 at the bottom to plus 800,000 at the top. The orange line shows the 12-month rolling net migration to the UK. The pink section of the bar chart shows immigration from non-European Union countries. The black section shows migration from EU countries, and the blue section shows British migration. And in terms of the critical dates for Brexit, which was when the United Kingdom exited from the European Union, despite the fact that the UK voted to leave in 2016, Brexit didn't actually occur until the 31st of January 2020, so at the start of 2020. And the introduction of the need for a visa for European unions to move to the UK was introduced in January 2021. So we start off by looking at the orange line. You can see that between December 2018 and September 2020, there was a downward trend in terms of net migration. In the year ending December 2018, the UK experienced net immigration of 276,000, and that figure was made up of immigration from non-European countries of 178,000, immigration from EU countries of 170,000, and net emigration of British nationals of 72,000. Now, as you can see, over the next 2 years, there was a rapid reduction in immigration from the European Union, but there was also a reduction in non-European Union immigration, partially as a result of the COVID pandemic, which restricted the movement of people And in the 12 months ending September 2020, the UK experienced net immigration of only 35,000, which was made up by an influx of 60,000 people from non-European countries, 45,000 people from the European Union, and net emigration of 70,000 British people. If we now take a moment to look at what's happened in terms of the net immigration from the European Union, the black section of this chart over the last 3 years, you can see that by December 2021, which was the year that visas were introduced for all European nationals, there was actually a net emigration of European Union citizens, 62,000 to be precise, who left the UK permanently. And that net emigration continued throughout 2022 and hit a peak in the year ending September when 135,000 European Unions left the UK for good. Now, the rate that European Union citizens are leaving the UK has actually reduced over the last 6 months, and in the period ending June 2023, 86,000 European Union nationals left the UK. If we now go back and have a look at what's been happening with net migration to the UK, you can see that between September 2020 and December 2022, there was a rapid increase in net migration to the UK. In September 2020, net migration was 35,000 people. However, in the 12 months ending December 2022, it was 745,000. And that figure was made up of an influx of 873,000 people from non-European countries, which was offset by 123,000 European Union citizens leaving. And interestingly, 4,000 British nationals actually returned back to the UK. So this is people who'd left the UK but have now decided to return. And if we look at the most recent 12-month figures for June 23, net immigration was 672,000 people, which was made up by the arrival of 768,000 non-European Union citizens, 86,000 European Union citizens leaving, and 10,000 British people deciding that they wanted to emigrate. So the overall summary of this chart is that over the last 2 years, the United Kingdom has seen a rapid increase in immigration. People originally born in the European Union have actually been leaving the UK, but this has been more than offset by a huge influx of people from other countries. And this chart shows the breakdown of why people officially moved to the UK in the 12 months ending June 2023. And what this shows is that the two main reasons for people being allowed into the UK are for education and work. In the last 12 months, 413,000 students were granted visas, which represents around 38% of all of the visas issued. 373,000 people, which represents around 34%, were granted work visas. 90,000 people, or around 8% of all immigrants, were granted asylum, and 83,000, around 7.5%, were granted access on humanitarian rights. Now, in terms of explaining the difference between an asylum visa and a humanitarian visa, in order to apply for asylum, the person must actually be inside the UK or at a port of entry in order to be granted refugee status. This means that claims for asylum cannot be made from outside the UK, and it's therefore not possible to apply to the UK government from abroad for permission to enter the UK as a refugee. And if you're wondering how an asylum seeker actually gets to the UK if no visas are available for this purpose, as you may well have seen from news footage, people have to arrive either illegally or as holders of valid visas which have been issued for some other purpose such as tourism. Once the person is inside the UK or at a port of entry, they must meet the legal definition of a refugee to be given an asylum visa. A refugee is defined in the Refugee Convention as a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. So basically, an applicant for an asylum visa must fear persecution for a specific reason, such as race, religion, nationality, or political opinion. If the UK authorities agree to grant asylum, a person is given 5 years permission to stay in the UK, with permission to work and study and access benefits such as the National Health Service. Refugees also have the right to seek family reunion with family members left behind. And after 5 years, they can apply for settlement, also known as indefinite leave to remain, assuming there has not been a significant change in their circumstances or the circumstances of their country of origin. And as you can see from the chart, 83,000 people, or around 7.5%, were given visas on a humanitarian basis. And an asylum seeker who does not meet the criteria for the grant of refugee status will be considered for humanitarian protection. And this is granted in a situation where there are substantial grounds to show that the applicant, if returned to the country of origin, would face a real risk of suffering serious harm, and serious harm is defined as the death penalty or execution, unlawful killing, torture or inhumane or degrading treatment, or serious and individual threat to a civilian's life or person by reason of indiscriminate violence in situations of international or internal armed conflict. A person granted humanitarian protection will get humanitarian protection permission to stay, which gives them the right to work and study and access the NHS and other benefits for a period of 5 years. At the end of the 5-year period, humanitarian immigrants will be able to apply for indefinite leave to remain, assuming there's not been a significant change in their circumstances or the circumstances in their country of origin. And the final specific section identified in terms of immigration in the UK in the last 12 months are for family visas, and 76,000 people, or around 7% of all immigrants, were granted this form of entry. And this basically relates to the circumstances we've just talked about, where somebody who's already been granted permission to stay in the UK wants to bring over some of their family members. In terms of answering the question as to where the majority of immigrants into the UK are coming from, these charts show the top 10 countries by birth and nationality of immigrants into the UK. If you start off by looking at the dark blue bar chart, which shows the country of birth, you can see that 9.3% of all immigrants into the UK came from India, 7.1% from Poland, 4.7% from Pakistan, 4.3% from Ireland, 3.6% from Germany, 3.4% from Romania, 3.2% from Nigeria, 3.1% from South Africa, 2.9% from Italy, and 2.5% from China. Now, interestingly, when you look at the nationality of the same migrant group, the data actually looks quite different. By nationality, Polish was actually the biggest percentage at 11.6%, followed by Irish at 6.2% and Indian at 6.2%, Romanian and Italian at 5.7%, Portuguese at 4.5%, Spanish 3.4%, Pakistani and Nigerian at 3%, and American at 2.8%. And I think this is a really interesting way to look at the data, because it tells us that some of the migrants that are moving to the UK who were born in certain countries actually are classified on their passports as having a different nationality. 9.3% of all of the immigrants were born in India. However, only 6.2% of that same immigrant group are registered as being Indian nationals. So that means that 3.1% of those people who were born in India actually have passports with a different nationality on them. And the same principle applies to Pakistan. 4.7% of all immigrants were born in Pakistan. However, only 3% of that same immigrant group are officially registered as being Pakistani on their passports. And the reverse position applies to Poland, Ireland, Romania, Italy, and Portugal. 7.1% of all of the immigrants into the UK were born in Poland. However, 11.6% were actually registered as being Polish nationality on their passports. So basically what we've got here are a group of people who've moved to Poland at some point, obtained Polish citizenship or nationality, and then moved on to the UK. The shortage occupation list is a list of occupations drawn up by the UK government to help employers fill vacancies by recruiting workers from overseas. The logic behind this list is that if there are insufficient workers currently located in the UK, employers are legally able to offer a lower salary to overseas workers to encourage them to move to the UK. So this is a way of the UK capitalising on the differential between what's paid in the UK and what's paid overseas for certain occupations, and allows businesses to pay below the market rate, so less than they would pay to UK-based employees, to bring people into the country to fill those vacancies. And as you can see from this list, in many situations, employers only need to pay 80% of the usual going rate for the listed occupations to sponsor an individual from overseas as a skilled worker. Once an overseas individual is identified, the company assigns a certificate of sponsorship to that individual, and they are then legally entitled to move to the UK. Now let's have a look at which occupations are designated as being in shortage. The first, and I think the most obvious in terms of the current crisis that's going on at the National Health Service, are workers in the health service. We've also got residential day and domestic care workers, chemical, biological and physical scientists, social and humanities scientists, civil engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, electronics engineers, design and development engineers, production and access engineers, engineering professionals not classified elsewhere, so basically a catch-all for all other engineers, IT business analysts, architects and system designers, program and software development professionals, web design and development professionals, IT and communication professionals not classified elsewhere, so basically anybody in IT, veterinarians, actuaries, economists and statisticians, architects, quality control and planned engineers, laboratory technicians, artists, dancers and choreographers. However, only skilled classical ballet dancers or skilled contemporary dancers who meet the standard required by internationally recognised UK ballet or contemporary dance companies. So basically, you're not going to get in if you just think you're quite good at dancing. Musicians, but only skilled orchestral musicians who are leaders, principals, sub-principals or numbered string positions and who meet the standards required by internationally recognised UK orchestras. So if you're just quite good at the trumpet, you're probably not going to get in. Arts officers, producers and directors, graphic designers, agriculture and fishing trades, welding trades, bricklayers and masons, roofers, roof tilers and slaters, carpenters and joiners, construction and building trades not classified elsewhere, so basically anybody in the building trade is eligible, plasterers, care workers and home carers. However, private households or individuals cannot sponsor skilled worker applicants. And interestingly, this is the only occupation that doesn't have a carte blanche 80% of the going rate. There is no going rate here. The salary must be at least £20,960 per year or £10.75 per hour. Senior care workers, so basically people who work in old people's homes, and interestingly the pay here is restricted to 80% of the going rate, which is £7.63 per hour, significantly less than the section above. And the final category is fishing and other elementary agriculture occupations not elsewhere classified. So basically if you work in agriculture or fishing, you're eligible. Now, I thought it'd be interesting to see how the UK compares to countries around the rest of the world in terms of what percentage of the population were born in other countries. And this chart compares 34 different countries. And as you can see, the United Kingdom, where 14% of the current population were born in other countries, is sitting very firmly in the middle of this chart. The 5 countries shown here with the lowest percentages are Mexico, where only 1% of the population was born outside of Mexico, Poland, where 2% were born outside of Poland, Turkey, where it's 3%, and 4 and 5 on this list are Slovakia and Chile, where 4% of the population were born outside of those countries. If we now have a look at the countries in double figures, 10% of the Italian population was born outside of Italy, it's 11% for Denmark and Portugal, 13% for Greece, Latvia, Slovenia, France and the Netherlands, 14% for the United States, the United Kingdom and Spain, 15% for Estonia, 16% for Norway and Germany, 17% for Belgium, 18% for Ireland and Iceland, 19% for Austria, 20% for Sweden, 21% for Canada and Israel, 27% for New Zealand, 30% for Switzerland and Australia, and the country with the highest percentage of population that was born outside of that country is Luxembourg with 47%. And the reason that Luxembourg has such a high percentage is that it's a very small country and it's both an administrative centre and also a tax haven in Europe, so a lot of people move there for work purposes. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video to tell you the latest news on what's going on with migration in the UK. Because migration is a hot topic. That is one of the reasons why a lot of people in the UK voted to leave the European Union because they were concerned with the freedom of movement, that there was going to be a huge influx of people coming from all of these European Union countries and that the UK wouldn't be able to cope. The infrastructure would be overloaded. But as we've seen from the data in today's video, immigration today is more than double what it was back in 2016. So anybody that voted for Brexit thinking that it was going to close the doors and stop people entering the UK have got it completely wrong, because immigration is at its highest level for more than 7 years. And of course, the UK government is fully aware of this. And Rishi Sunak is now under immense pressure because a lot of voters are unhappy with how Brexit was handled and what the outcomes have been. Because from UK voters' perspective, the main things that they can see are higher prices on the shelves, because everything that's being imported from the European Union now has some form of tax added to it, and increasing immigration. So Rishi Sunak and his Conservative Party are currently miles behind in the polls, and it's very likely that they will lose control of the UK government when the next general election occurs, which is probably going to be in May or June 2024. So in order to try to do something about this, Rishi Sunak has now introduced this new legislation. He's increased the minimum salary that skilled workers can be paid to move to the UK, and it's quite a chunky increase. So that potentially will restrict the amount of people moving to the UK. But the problem that businesses in the UK have is that there's still a worker shortage. The reason that the shortage occupation list was put together was to try to encourage people from other countries to come to the UK to fill the vacancies. So increasing the minimum amount that they're paid is going to make it more difficult for employers to be able to find people to fill those jobs. And from an economic point of view, if you've got jobs that are unfilled, obviously that means that those companies are not maximising their potential. They're not delivering the amount of income and profit that they could be if they had more people, and that will therefore have a knock-on negative impact to the UK economy. If a lot of companies have their growth restricted, then that will restrict the growth of the UK. Now, I should mention that in terms of the NHS crisis, the latest legislation excludes health workers and care workers, so people can still enter the country to do those jobs. And that's obviously good news from a welfare perspective. And also, those people tend to be very lowly paid. As we saw from the shortage occupation list, we're talking somewhere in the region of £7.50 to £10.50 per hour. So a lot of people can still enter the country if they want very low paid jobs. But as we saw from the data, only around 34% of all of the migrants that came to the UK in the last 12 months came here under work visas. So that means that the vast majority, 2/3 of all of the people who came here for different reasons. The biggest single group, students, represented 38%. And of course, increasing the minimum wage for skilled workers will have absolutely no impact on that group of immigrants. And one of the things that was recently identified as a weakness in the system is that a lot of students are let into the country on a visa which is either for 3 or 5 years. However, there are very little controls and regulations to make sure that those people actually leave the country at the end of their visa, and those individuals can subsequently apply for permission to stay. And as we also saw from the data, almost 25% of all migrants came to the UK either seeking residency on the grounds of asylum or humanitarian grounds or family reasons. They had people who were already here and they wanted to join them. So this new legislation will not deal with any of that sort of migration. And even though the total number of people coming to the UK is actually declining on a natural basis, the new legislation is unlikely to have a major impact in terms of volume of people. But what it could potentially do is restrict the number of workers moving to the UK to fill those vacancies, which will have a negative impact on the UK economy. So the overall summary of today's video is that net migration over the last 12 months has increased significantly. We are talking more than double what the UK had back in 2016. The UK government have identified this as a problem that they want to deal with. They want to reduce migration. They've introduced new legislation which increases the minimum amount that people are allowed to be paid in certain jobs. However, doing that doesn't address the vast majority of people who came to the UK over the last 12 months. And so it's unlikely to have a major impact on net migration figures. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.